Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Reducing Risk Through Material Science with Medical Design and Outsourcing and Battelle. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your console are multiple application widgets. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can use the Q&A widget. We'll capture all questions and answer them either at the end of the presentation or via email. And a copy of today's slide deck is available on the resource list widget, which is the green folder at the bottom of your screen. You can expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon, or you can drag the bottom right corner of the slide area. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available approximately one day after and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. So I am Heather Thompson. I'm the Senior Editor of Medical Design and Outsourcing. And joining me today is Jeff Ellis, the Principal Research Scientist at Battelle. Dr. Ellis has a PhD in chemical engineering from Ohio State University, and he focused on supercritical fluid polymer processing of diagnostic medical devices at the nanoscale. And he's worked at Battelle for about 7 years and held the position as lead scientist on a number of programs with specialization in polymer processing, selection, failure analysis testing, degradation, and aging. And he has implemented data-driven solutions to technical challenges for many pharmaceutical and diagnostic medical companies in their development phase and after commercialization. His work has produced a number of publications and patents. And today we're talking about material device failures, which are common, and the risk of those failures can be greatly reduced through better understanding of material science earlier in the product development cycle that can prevent both delays and post-market issues. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Heather. That was a great introduction. So yes, I've worked here at Battelle for now 8 years, and that really gives me a unique perspective into this topic of material failures for medical devices. I've gotten to work with a number of different pharmaceutical and diagnostic companies and seen the development cycle for different products, as well as the other end of it, looking at failures and doing root cause failure analysis for things that have gone wrong late in the development process or after launch. So to dive into this talk then, I'd like to start with how important material failures in this space are. And to show that, Battelle did a deep dive into some public FDA literature on recalls. So in the data from 2013 and from 2014, we looked into it, and we looked at all the medical recalls that were out there and saw that we classified them into different areas, such as materials as a major cause, materials as a possible cause, electronics as a major cause, or other issues. So as a materials group here that I work in, we were most interested in those material parts. So in 2013, you can see that all of the FDA recalls that we were able to find, over 30% of them were a material cause. And in 2014, it was over 40%. So this is a very common failure mode for either a drug delivery device or a diagnostic device. And I have some examples here that are very recent. I try to keep up on the news on what's going on and what's being recalled. Here's one. It's a shoulder from Zimmer Biomet, and it has to do with the shoulder material fracturing much sooner than they thought it would. So this is definitely a material issue, that polymer material in there is fracturing. And maybe with a little bit more understanding or a little more testing earlier in the cycle, this could have been avoided. That's what this talk is going to get into. And then I have one more example here. This one is a patient safety and an FDA warning on an absorbable, bioabsorbable stent. So what this one is, the data is showing is that people that have had this stent implanted are more likely to have heart attacks further down the line. So this is even a much more complicated case because it's not only a material issue, but it's how your body handles that material after it's been absorbed into your body. So just a couple of quick examples of, these things are happening out there in the last couple months. Secondly, material failures are costly. So as you can imagine, the two that I just brought up, there's issue with those and with others, and I'd like to just go over some of the general costs that you may incur if you have one of these medical failures. First one is patient safety. So all of us engineers designing these devices, we're trying to help people. We're not trying to hurt people. So keeping patients safe is definitely on our mind during the design. And if something were to go wrong, that would be costly for the company. In terms of reputation. So if something were to go wrong, then you could hurt reputation for your product, for your brand, for your company. And of course that could lead to costly consequences. Third, you have to do a root cause failure analysis. If you do have one of these FDA recalls, part of that is you have to understand the fundamental science and understand why it failed, come up with a fix on how to fix it, and show that that will work. So that is quite costly and time-consuming. You have to go back and do that fundamental science that you didn't do in the first place. So trying to do that after the fact, when you may already have a product on the market, is going to be quite costly to get done. If you do have product in the market, product shutdown, as well as supply chain issues are, again, equal money. Your sales, you're not allowed to sell anything during an FDA recall until you get that failure analysis done, understand it, and provide a solution that you show works. So the sales drop to zero until you can go through that process. And then thinking a little bit differently, so let's say your product's not out on the market yet, but you're in late phase clinicals and you have to push your launch date back. It could cost you market share. It could cost you more time and more development costs later in the cycle. Trying to make a material change late in clinicals is very difficult to do. That can be months and months to get done and then show that it still will work. So even late phase before launching it is an issue. So all of this adds up to money. So again, the failures, material failures for medical devices, they're common and they're costly. And I want to get into the meat of this talk and talk about how we can reduce those failures. So there's two parts to this talk. I'll start with common deficiencies in material property data sheets, as well as a little bit of insight into material selection, how we can choose materials that will yield lower risk on the back end. And then the second part of it is talking about more complex failures that we've seen through some of the projects here. And we'll talk about process structure exposure relationship, that all of those things come together to yield material properties. And sometimes two of them go wrong at the same time to cause a very complicated technical failure that seems to be somewhat random, but once you figure it out, it makes sense. So I will go through some examples that describe that. So here's a typical data sheet, and typical data sheets have things on the bottom of them, like this one here in red. It says data herein is typical and not to be constructed as specifications. So right there it's saying, yes, this is typical data for this material, but you probably shouldn't use it to design a device. So I think sometimes we do because it's there and we need to grab onto something and we need to start putting it into our calculations to show if it works or not. And it's great for that upfront work, but as we get a little bit further down the line, we need more real data. So some of the problems that you can run into if you just use this data. Up at the top there it says these were injection molded specimens. So the processing can change your material properties. So it's good that they told us they're injection molded, they're not extruded, they're not processed some other way. It's still not detailed enough. It doesn't say the pressure and the temperature they used to extrude this material, or the machine that they used it, or the gate locations on that tensile bar that they molded. Could be one gate, could be two gates. So there's still a lot of ambiguity based on around this statement that they're injection molded. How are they injection molded? So if you injection mold differently with different parameters, again, you may get different properties. Let's jump down to the mechanical section here. And looking at tensile strength. So they have one number for tensile strength there. They used ASTM D638, and that's a widely used test. It's a great test. The problem is it's always run at 23 degrees C and 50% relative humidity. So if you're going to be using your samples at any other temperature or humidity, you may get a number that's quite a bit different than that. So if you think about if you put yours in the refrigerator, then you may get a tensile strength that's significantly different than that because you're 15 degrees C different than where the temperature was for that test. The next thing on here is tensile elongation, and this one's a bit vague, so it says it's greater than 10%. It also doesn't say if it's the elongation at yield or at break. So those are two very different things, and we like to design for underneath or less than yield for all of our parts because we don't want to have plastic deformation. Some elastic deformation may be okay, but once you get past that yield point, you don't want to get into plastic deformation for designing a part. So here, again, we don't know what type of elongation, and then we don't know if it's 11% or 1100%. It's greater than 10. So again, just a little bit too vague to really use as a design. And the third thing, the modulus. The modulus is calculated by taking stress and dividing by strain in a certain strain range, which is supposed to be linear, and that's called out in that ASTM D638. But they're not telling us exactly where they chose the strain, and basically we need to line up the modulus of the material with the strain range that we will be using it in. So we need to find out what we're straining the material to, and we need to use the stress strain curve and not just a single number to find out if it matches up with our design. Next, I'll go into some examples of some more detailed examples of where these material data sheets may come up a little bit light on information. So usually you do not have temperature-dependent stress-strain curves represented in a material data sheet. So if you think about a system that's frozen, so again, we're probably testing at room temperature, 23 degrees C, but our material, which is the bag in this picture, holds a high-value liquid, and we know that the elongation at yield is one number on the data sheet, but as you get colder and colder, that number becomes lower and lower. So the data sheet includes the room temperature. It also includes the glass transition temperature, and you've looked that up too, so you're confident that the material is not going to become brittle at your freezer temperature. It's still going to be rubbery because you're above the glass transition temperature. But what you don't anticipate is that stress-strain curve also shifting and the modulus getting higher, that elongation at break getting lower. So you're missing out on tensile properties at freezer conditions. So here maybe you've designed for one elongation, but that was at room temperature. Now you're in a freezer, and when that material, the fluid inside the bag, freezes and expands, it could cause it to go past that yield point at the freezer temperature and cause a rupture. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. Next is dynamic material properties are not represented in material data sheets. So in dynamic systems, and I'm talking about anything that oscillates or vibrates, the oscillation or vibration can actually move the glass transition temperature. So much like a material can become brittle when it becomes cold, it can also become brittle if you vibrate it fast enough. So if you think about silly putty, if you roll it into a ball and throw it very fast, it stays as a solid, it bounces back up and you catch it, but if you put it on the table, it flattens out. So that's this, where if you hit something fast enough, it acts like a solid, and it actually could be a brittle solid at that point. So materials may become brittle at temperatures higher than static systems. So if you think about maybe a drug delivery device that has a motor in it, so you get a little bit of oscillation when that motor's running, those materials may become brittle at a higher temperature than you expect. Same thing with a spring-driven device where you have an insertion or injection spring, and there's a very high-frequency event that happens quickly upon the actuation of that device. Those materials, again, could act brittle when you don't think they should at room temperature. And finally, something like this one with the piezoelectric crystal in it, that's going to have some vibration. And amplitude matters as well, so you have to take that into account. You can test for this dynamic dependence using a dynamic mechanical analyzer. So a DMA is a great piece of equipment to use to see how much your material properties shift due to a frequency change. Other properties that usually are not represented on material data sheets are long-term strain and long-term stress. Sometimes they are. There are some very good data sheets out there that include these types of things, but I just wanted to define them a little bit better so it's understood what the difference is. So stress relaxation is when you have constant deformation on a part, and if you look at the little picture on the left there of the arms inside the clutch gear, they have constant deformation because that clutch gear is always the same size, and those arms are pressing out against it. But the force is dropping off over time. As that polymer relaxes, it drops off over time. So if you look at that bottom graph, that's what happens over time. So that's stress relaxation. And in this case, if it would drop off far enough, you would lose your clutch and you could get slippage in that little gear. The second one is creep. So creep is another long-term function of polymers, and this one is a constant force. So think of the spring that's up against that blue piece of plastic on the right. It's putting a constant force on there, and then that blue piece is constantly deforming. So the deformation gets more and more over time, but that spring is still pressing on it, so you have nearly a constant force as it extends a little bit. And you could get deformation of parts to the point where they don't fit or interact well with the parts around them or don't function as they're supposed to if they're deformed. So that's the downside of long-term creep. So these are things that we can, again, test for with a DMA, but we need to do them using time-temperature superposition. Since we don't have years to wait to do the test, we can do the tests at higher temperatures and then relate those back to room temperature and longer time. So that's how we get it measuring long-term properties in a short amount of time using some standard equipment. So I've mentioned some mechanical properties and some thermal properties. These are great for starting your material selection process, but I think there's a whole host of other properties that are also important when choosing a material. So I've listed some here, and I'll briefly go through a couple of them. Chemical or biocompatibility. So again, whatever fluids may be up against this. We need to make sure that there's chemical compatibility, that there's not an acid in there that's going to be eating the polymer that we chose. It has to look good. If this is a skin on a device, the aesthetics matter, so you have to make sure we're picking something that looks good. Interaction with other parts. So a system property is friction, so we have to worry about sliding parts one over the other. If it's sliding for a long time, that would be long-term wear. Otherwise, it might be just a spring pushing one thing that slides one time, and the friction has to be low enough. So we have to worry about what lubricants are in that material to make sure that one time works. CTE is coefficient of thermal expansion, and if you have parts that are interacting with each other and they're quite small, we have to make sure that one's not expanding more than the other and putting too much stress on it, or the other way around, it's taking the stress off of it. We have to make sure that when we go through temperature changes, if this product goes through temperature changes, that we're not losing the interfaces. How are we going to process the material? Is it injection moldable, thermoformable? Are we going to do a laser and ultrasonic weld to fit the whole device together? Long term, we've been through those, so stress relaxation, creep. Then think about things like moisture uptake. If you're using a nylon 6 can take up to 6% of water out of just the ambient humidity. So you have to worry about swelling. You have to worry about loss of mechanical properties. It gets tougher, but the modulus drops when that happens. Barrier properties. Are you worried about boiling a product with oxygen? So you have to pick the right material so oxygen can't get through it. Dynamic properties, we had a slide on that already. Regulatory compliance. So this is extractables and leachables and making sure that the FDA is comfortable with your material going to market. Electrical or magnetic. And then the last thing is price, availability, and world supply. So Ultem is a great engineered plastic, and there was a world shortage just a couple years ago. So things like that happen. So if you're thinking about making 10 million widgets over the next 10 years, then you need to look ahead and see, is this really a commodity product, or is it only made by one manufacturer, and I really have to worry about supply chain issues in the future. So material data sheets, I said a lot of mean things about them, but really they're useful and they're necessary. We need to use them to start our process of the engineered design. But they rarely provide enough information to support a robust engineering design. So we need to do testing at the use conditions. If it's going to be used in the freezer, if it's going to be used outside in humid conditions, we need to do tests at those conditions. And we have to make sure that it's going to last for the duration. You may have subcomponents that sit on a shelf for 2 years, assembled devices that sit on a shelf for 2 years, and then they go into the refrigerator for 2 years. So some of these devices are out there a long time after they're molded, and we have to make sure that we think about that entire life cycle to make sure they'll last the duration. So that's the first half of the talk. And now the second half, so material selection is only half the battle. So first part was quite technical and complicated, and that's still only halfway there. So even with careful and considerate material selection, other factors can collude. This is where I'm going to show 4 examples of things that we've worked on here at Battelle, of structure, process, and environment, all affecting the material properties. And these examples are ones where at least 2 of those, the structure and the process, or the process and the environment, come into play together to create a failure that was unforeseen. I'm going to start by showing a complicated diagram that we put together here at Battelle, and we believe this covers a good number of failures for materials. Shows the complex interplay between these three variables, the structure, process, and the environment. So up at the top, you can have things like in-service degradation. You may be getting hydrolysis because you have a polyester, so you're getting more brittle and weaker as it ages in a humid environment. Over on the right-hand side, we have reagents and raw material stability. So are you choosing the right formulation, or do you have an impact modifier that maybe doesn't fit with the rest of your system and isn't mixable with it, so you're getting more than one phase? So they're improperly prepared resins. Down at the bottom, we have manufacturing and process incompatibility. So are you designing this to have high stresses in some places? Improper mold design, so maybe you're burning a part out in one place where it shouldn't be, or it's not filling right. And then over on the left-hand side, improper material selection. So we can go back to the regulatory, the extractable, leachable properties under use conditions. So you chose the material that would work at room temperature, but you're using it in the freezer. So we'll come back to this chart after each of the examples, and I'll circle the parts that I believe were the issue for that failure. So this is the first example, and it's a polymer container that was stored in the freezer and filled with a high-value product. So this was an extruded, blow-molded container, and they had, I'd say, dozens of them in the freezer, and every once in a while, one of them would break after months and months of being in an ultra-cold freezer. It seemed random, and we started looking at the broken ones versus the good ones that didn't break after being in there for so long. And what we found is that at the Parison pinch point, so that point where after the extrusion is done, it pinches off, and then you do the blow molding, was not consistent. So that is the least consistent part of the container. The wall thickness there varied more than any part of the container, as well as the design for that jug, that was the highest stress point. So it had the sharpest corner. So that left picture is microscopy of that Parison pinch point, and the right is an FEA image showing stress at that sharp corner. The red is high stress, and it's right in that same corner where we saw the highest inconsistency in wall thickness in this polymer container. So when fluid was put in there and then frozen, it would expand when it freezes and put a little bit of stress down on that corner, and when the wall was too thin, it would break. So this one, going back to the chart, we believe was process and environment. So the properties under use conditions, which was, again, an ultra-cold freezer here, it was still above the TG of the polymer, so the polymer was chosen correctly. This is not an issue of choosing the right material, but that was done properly. But what wasn't taken into account was the amount that the elongation decreased when we went from room temperature down to this very cold freezer. And the second part was the high stress design, so the stress in the corner of that material. The second example has to do with being able to mix components together. So this one, there was a PVC blend that was a styrene acrylonitrile and PVC with an acrylic impact modifier. This material, I guess the final device, what we saw was that some of them were discolored and became embrittled, and we were able to look at some good ones and some bad ones again. And what we saw when we dyed it and looked at the microstructure, we saw a difference in the domains. So the top right picture is a nice homogeneous mix of the components in this polymer system, and it shows that it makes a good, strong polymer. The middle picture there with the blue dots shows that the domains are separated. And the problem with the domains being separated is it allows water to be able to get into this material and cause moisture-induced cavitation. So it's very important that the mixing occurs in one phase. And when we looked into this some more, we found that the phase diagram for the PVC SAN was that bottom image. And at higher temperatures, we got two phases in the melt when this was being mixed together. And that caused the problem. So we don't want two phases. We want a nice homogeneous mix. And when we moved that processing window for temperature to the lower portion of it, we got a one-phase melt, which always makes good material. So for this one, just by changing the processing window to make it smaller, we were able to always get that one-phase melt and to eliminate this failure mode. This one we believe was structure and process. Structure being the processing-induced structure, so that mixing at the higher temperature was the process-induced structure. And then there was also formulation incompatibility, which is tied up in the processing, and improperly prepared resin. So, again, this is a complicated mix of at least two of these three factors going wrong at the same time and causing some of the material to fail. The third example is an ion sensing membrane. So this is a hydrogel membrane that's in a microchannel, and you flow a bodily fluid sample past it, and you can measure the amount of ions that are in that sample. And that works by adding an ionophore to the hydrogel membrane, and then the charge is conducted through the hydrogel to a platinum wire and then to a sensor. What the client saw was they had some electrical noise going on, and the SEM images, the top left one, shows the whole hydrogel, the whole sensor, and then the one on the right is a zoom in. And what we found is that there was actually ionophore that was supersaturated that had come out of the hydrogel solution, come to the surface, nucleated, and formed crystals. So crystals were growing on that surface. You can see the little flat plates of crystals. So the question was, why was this happening? This was clearly the reason that the ions couldn't get through. We were in a crystalline phase instead of miscible with the hydrogel. So we looked into it a little bit more and asked questions about what had changed in the recent past. One thing was that the concentration of the ionophore had been increased to try to get a better signal. And the second thing was the plasticizer, the PVC card that the microchannels are molded into had a different plasticizer than the original PVC. And that plasticizer also played part of the role here, that when it leached into the hydrogel, it caused this supersaturation, nucleation, and crystal growth that came out. So this was, again, a very complicated system of things going wrong. It wasn't just one thing. It was a number of things that all came together at the same time. This one was structure. So the structure was a crystalline ionophore instead of in solution. And the environment, for this one I'm calling the environment the close proximity of the hydrogel with the PVC, and then getting the leachable out of that PVC, the plasticizer, into the hydrogel. So it was a formulation incompatibility, and the material replacement is what started all of this. So a structure and an environment on that one. So I have one more example to go through here, and this is a polymer embrittlement example where there was a medical device that was failing a drop test after aging. So one of the materials on this was failing the drop test. It wasn't failing before aging, but just after. It was a PBT material, which is a polyester, which is susceptible to hydrolysis, which gives you shorter molecular weight and causes embrittlement. We were able to find out the molecular weight of the material both before and after aging by gel permeation chromatography. Then we also used melt viscosity, much easier to measure than gel permeation chromatography. So we showed that those correlated, and then we used melt viscosity to show how much molecular weight we lost before and after aging. And it wasn't all that much, so we thought back and we said, what else is happening to this material before it gets to the aging process? So we looked back, and it turned out that there was a separate step for coloring. So the resin gets made, then it got colored, which was a hot process. Hydrolysis happens faster at elevated temperatures. So there was a coloring, and then there was an injection molding. So there were two steps, and those are both on the little chart there, and you can see how much the molecular weight or the melt viscosity decreases after each of those steps. So what we found is it decreased very much during each one of those steps, and what the suggestion was is we should do the coloring and the injection molding at the same time to reduce the number of processing steps and therefore keep this material more tough with less hydrolysis so it doesn't break during a drop test. So as far as I know, that's been working out well for this product, is by reducing one of those processing steps, we're able to shift that entire curve up, and it doesn't embrittle after aging. This was a process and an environment. So the environment caused hydrolysis because there's humidity in the environment, and temperature and humidity are what cause hydrolysis. And also it was a process because we had to go back to how they colored it and how they injection molded it. So those were processing issues directly related with this material. So, in conclusion, I do believe that device failures can be reduced. Material failures in medical devices are common and costly. Failure risk can be mitigated by better understanding of material properties at use conditions. Also, material properties are dependent on process, structure, and exposure, just as I've shown in some of these examples. You really have to think hard about, again, the use conditions and the total life cycle of the product that you're making so we can go back and do a careful material selection around it. And finally, combining subject matter expertise, advanced characterization, testing at use conditions, and experienced device design can provide a robust solution. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Yeah, we'll turn it over to the Q&A portion. We do have some questions coming in, but you are welcome to add yours. If you have any questions, you can use the widget below. And if we don't get to all the questions, we'll have Jeff follow up with you. Now let's turn over to our first question. So, Jeff, what type of equipment do I need to test my materials at the conditioner?
That's a good question. I talked a lot about testing materials at different temperatures. And I think with just a few attachments to your Instron, you can get a lot of the mechanical data that you need at different temperatures. So there's a box that you can actually buy that goes around your tensile bar sample, and it comes with an electrical heater, or we've rigged ours up so you can also hook up liquid nitrogen to it so we can get down to those ultra cold temperatures. So using one of those boxes around your sample and allowing your sample to come to thermal equilibrium calibration before you test it. Depending on the thickness, obviously, that's going to be a different amount of time. But doing those things and testing it at the conditions that you're going to be using it, you can get the stress strain curve for your conditions. The second piece of equipment I would really recommend is the DMA, the Dynamic Mechanical Analyzer. And the extra data that you can get out of that is the frequency response. So if your materials are becoming more brittle because they're being vibrated, that instrument can also test for that. DMAs typically also can do the full temperature range. So they can do temperature sweeps and frequency sweeps.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. The next question I have is that often reusable medical devices are cleaned with harsh disinfectants. How do you plan for avoiding failures that can occur during such cleanings?
So there are many different disinfectants out there that hospitals use. There's a number of different ways to kill microorganisms, so there are a whole host of different chemicals that go into the cleaners. The best way that we've tested for it, I believe, is either taking the cleaner itself, if you know a certain cleaner is going to be used, or taking the chemicals that the cleaner is made up of and doing an environmental stress cracking resistance test. So that includes taking tensile bars, soaking them in the, say, detergent or cleaner, antibacterial that is planned to be used on it, putting the tensile bars under stress and soaking them in that environment, and possibly heating too, and seeing if that material holds up to it. You can check it for cracks. You can see if it breaks. You can look at the surface, make sure it's not crazing. So I think that's a really good test to see how it'll hold up against different chemicals wiping it down.
Perfect. Thank you. We have a question here that it might be a bit of a deep dive. Important for additive manufacturing.
So for additive manufacturing, your materials are more limited, I would say. So I get asked a lot about can we 3D print this part and then also do accelerated testing on it. And you really have to look at the properties of that material and how it ages. So I think by knowing how it gets printed in the 3D printer, what type of temperatures and pressures it can withstand for that printing, or then you can also look back at, I guess you could make some assumptions about how it's going to hold up for a long-term stressor strain environment. I think, if you really want to test those, you'd have to print them out. You'd have to print the materials possibly into tensile bars and then go ahead and do the testing on the Instron or the DMA. I'm talking about all polymers here. I know there's some additive manufacturing for metals that I'm a little less familiar with. But I'm not sure if I answered that question, but I hope I did.
We'll see if they have a follow-up. Actually, we are running a little short on time. I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll wrap it up. But how would you improve material data sheets? Is there a way that you think we can make them better?
Yeah. So every design takes a different set of data, unfortunately. So I can't say, well, we just need to add this one section to each data sheet and then it'll be perfect. But what I do think would really help from the manufacturers is putting the stress strain curves on there instead of just putting a number for elongation and a number for tensile stress and for modulus. Having the whole curve there really helps us, especially when we go to model these things in FEA and to do, dynamic drops in FEA and things like that. So I think having the whole stress strain curve there, and that's just so much more value than those three numbers that I mentioned. And usually those are only run at one temperature, so that would be really no more testing for a manufacturer. It would just be a change of what they report to the data sheet. What also would be helpful is to run that at a number of temperatures. So you could put a number of different stress strain curves at different temperatures all on the same plot. I think those mechanical properties with temperature changes would be helpful from a design standpoint.
Great, thank you. That's all the time we have for our presentation today. I want to say thank you to our attendees, and Jeff, thank you so much for this great insight. Everyone have a great day.
Great. Thank you, Heather.